Right, let's go on to talk about the Scottish Conservatives, because they have a new leader. It is Russell Findlay. He has spent the last few days at the Conservative Party conference in Birmingham, and there's a few news lines to pick out of this new leadership, this new era for the Scottish Conservatives. First of all, I am going to start with this. It turns out they have fewer members than the Alba Party. Andy, are you shocked by that? This was revealed by the number of eligible voters was, a little over 7,000 or so in the leadership contest, meaning that Alex Salmond's party's bigger.
I'm not shocked by it, but I also don't care very much. I've never really cared about membership numbers. We measure political parties an awful lot by the number of members they have. But
yeah.
I don't think it's that good a measure. I'm not remotely interested whether the party that governs the country is the one that has the most members or not. I just don't think it's really relevant. Members of political parties, as I've said many times on this podcast before, members of political parties are not a good cross-section of society, right? They're really not. You're talking here, we're in Birmingham this week, the Tories are in Birmingham this week, right? You're talking about people who take 3 days off work and spend £3,000 to go and listen to politicians at their worst, because that's what politicians are at when they're at a party conference. I'm afraid these are not the sort of people who I see in the street and at the school gate every day, right? It's not sort of normal life. So sure. I don't really care how many members. But it speaks to how capable you are as a party at mobilising around elections and stuff, doesn't it? Because if you've got it speaks to how capable you are at motivating the extremes of your vote.
Yeah. So the Scottish Tories have
most people there are. Yeah. So but the Tories also get many hundreds of thousands of people voting for them. The proportion of Tory voters who are Tory members is extremely small. I think we need to be more interested in the sort of people who vote for political parties rather than the sort of people who are actually members of political parties. That's my personal view. I have nothing personal against those who are so highly motivated that they want to go to Birmingham and spend all their money this week at a hotel listening to politicians speak. I'm just not one of them, and the proximity to normality is just not quite there for me.
Yeah. I think I should probably provide a bit of counterbalance to what Andy said, given that 80% of Scottish parliamentarians listen to our podcast. You've got to imagine that they're all members of a political party, and presumably a lot of other members follow us as well. So Andy Maciver's not going to be the head of business development for Holyrood Sources. Let's just confirm that. But look, listen, I accept the point. I'm not a member of any political party. The biggest challenge for the Tories on a UK level, given the conference is being held just now in Birmingham, is that they got a lower share of the vote in this past general election and far fewer votes than Labour got in the disastrous 1983 general election. The Tories got 6.8 million votes and 23.7% in 2024. Labour got 8.5 million votes and 27.6% in 1983. It took them 3 more elections to win. That is the scale of the challenge ahead of the Conservative Party. And I suppose what Andy's point he's making rather clumsily, and not to offend our listeners, is that is what they need to address, not their membership.
Don't worry about
in the
offending our
first
listeners.
instance.
You just offended me by calling me clumsy. Let me attempt to make a less clumsy point. The Tory vote share in Scotland went down to under 13%, so it's the lowest it's ever been. But that's based on a turnout of, I think, about 60% or so. One of the biggest problems the Tories have got is that if you line up 100 people, only seven of them voted for the party of the centre-right in Scotland. Now, you would fairly presume, if Scotland is anything like other European countries...
Normal countries,
you'd fairly presume that probably between 40 and 50% of them would generally identify with what might be termed centre-right values. Yeah. But only 7 out of every 100 decided to wake up on July the 4th and go to the polling booth and cross the box for the only party of the centre-right. And we saw actually some analysis yesterday. Joe, sorry, I should have had this ready. You're going to have to do a little edit on that. I need to remember. I sent that graph to you guys yesterday, but it was... what's the name of that? We saw a bit of analysis yesterday, actually, that came through to me on Twitter by the Politics and International Relations Department at the University of Edinburgh. Fraser McMillan and Alan Convery were looking at it, and that showed where the Tory vote went. And as I have said in this podcast for a long time, and before we started this podcast for a long time, that all the Tory votes, people were presuming that this 25% of people who were voting Tory were Conservative voters. I've always said they were Unionist voters and that they would go back to Labour as soon as independence was seen to be off the table. And this analysis that I mentioned by Fraser and Allen has shown that. So, around about 10% of that Tory vote went straight to Labour because they were transactional voters who weren't really Conservatives. And so the Conservatives find themselves once again in the place where their ceiling is really about 15%. And the reality is you can't be in government if that's your ceiling and if no other parties like you. So the Tory party problem remains exactly as it really has always been.
Yeah. Alan Convery was my dissertation supervisor, by the way, which is nice. Nice to hear his name again. Just to continue our conversation on Russell Findlay then. So, with all of that in mind, as by way of context, we come to this, reported by Simon Johnson, Scottish political editor of The Telegraph, that the Scottish Tories are to boycott any attempts by the SNP to debate independence at Holyrood in a campaign of political sabotage, is how it's described. Now, I'm always among the most reluctant people to have conversations always dominated by independence because there's so much else going on. But we've kind of touched on other points, and this seems to be the direction that Russell Findlay is setting when it comes to the constitutional question. Geoff, is this a gift for the SNP? Is this a political blunder by the Scottish Conservatives? How would you describe
it? When Russell Findlay appeared in our special for the leadership, I thought he did really well. I thought, actually, all three candidates did really well, and it was actually an enjoyable session. But he talked about trying to not just bring the party together, but bring the country together. And I just felt that, given that they've got such low membership numbers, as we've discussed, that to try and appeal to a wider electorate, you need to accept the democratic wishes of the voters, your constituents. And 45%, there or thereabout, believe in Scottish independence. And then to turn around and say, right, we're not engaging in any political debate on this on this issue really was, I think, unnecessary. I can understand why you might do it in an election campaign to be leader, to try and mobilise those 6,000 or so members and say, right, I'm the one to talk about, because that might speak to them. But to speak to the wider country, it just kind of flies in the face of democratic principle. Far better to say, well, we'll take you on the issues and we're going to prove while the union is so important. Much better to do that than just say, we're not going to debate it at all. I just thought it was a little bit, quite frankly, immature and disappointing because you're limiting your appeal to the electorate. Yeah. Simple as that.
Andy?
I think there's also a strategic problem. Russell Findlay is in a very, very difficult position. Okay, as we saw during the podcast and as we've discussed before, there isn't anything wrong with Russell Findlay as a prospective leader. He's got a pretty decent backstory. I think he can be pretty good. He's got, he's a good sort of person to be leader of the Tories, and I think in another time and place he could do pretty well. But he's taking over a party which is currently sitting on 31 seats and 23% of the vote at Holyrood, and he's got 18 months. Now, it is inconceivable, unless there is some seismic political event that changes everything, that he's going to be able to hold on to anything like that level of seats, and he'll be relegated into third place. And he's going to have to find a way to change the narrative so that that doesn't look like his failure, because it won't be his failure. Part of the problem that he's created for himself is he's very actively said, we need a new narrative. We can't just say no to IndyRef 2 anymore because IndyRef 2 is off the table. And in fact, he said in Birmingham that independence is dead. So I think the difficulty is when you say, we need a new narrative, independence is dead, we need to get back to the real issues. If you then make your first thing to say, we're going to block all debates about independence, for me, those two things are not entirely consistent strategically. So I think he's got a tough gig ahead. And I think he needs to make sure that he surrounds himself with people who are able to lift their head up and look a little bit over the horizon, rather than the people who he's probably surrounded himself with so far, who are very tactical and very much from the school of believing that job one is to fight nationalists and there is no job two.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, Andy. The second point was just linked to what you said latterly there. I do think you should find an accommodation for Murdo Fraser and Megan Gallagher in pretty senior shadow positions, because I think they did themselves quite a lot of favours actually through the campaign. I think I was really impressed with, like, I don't want this to sound patronising, but I thought Megan Gallagher has really improved through her time in the Parliament, and she's got quite a lot to offer. And Murdo Fraser's very capable. I mean, I can tell you from my experience of working in government, even back then, it's like if you knew Murdo Fraser was coming on to a debate or something like that, you're like, right, whoever you were prepping, you're like, make sure that you've got your lines together here, because he'll have a good go at you, And so I would thought that trying to put those three as a triumvirate around you wouldn't be the worst idea. Now, I don't understand the intricacies of the relationships and all the rest of it. It was a little bit of a difficult contest at times, but I think the whole point of leadership, if you're really going to try and bring your party together, is reach out to those who you debated in the leadership contest.
Yeah, can I just, if you'll just indulge me for 30 seconds as well on that last point. Obviously Murdo and I are pals, and I've known Murdo for over 20 years. At a time when you acknowledge that you need to create a conservative centre-right agenda and move on from the independence thing, you can't do it without Murdo Fraser. Murdo Fraser is the intellectual backbone of the Scottish Conservative Party and has been for 20 years. So this is a party that hasn't really had a coherent conservative agenda since the days of David and Cletchie. The 2003 manifesto, which seems like a world away now, is the last time there was actually a coherent set of consistent centre-right policies. And that's the sort of thing that I think Russell Findlay wants to get back to. I'm not convinced he can get back to it without Murdo Fraser. I think similarly to the SNP in some ways, actually, the party, the MSPs, are very largely people who've come in since the referendum. So their mindset is focused around the constitutional question rather than the ideological question. And I think we're going to have to, we talked about minority government, obviously Geoff has a lot of expertise in that as well. I think we're going to get back to a phase after 2026 where we need to start thinking about a parliament that works in the way it was supposed to, and that's perhaps more based on pragmatism and ideas and ideology than it is on the constitutional side of things. And so, Murdo Fraser has, I think, done a good thing. He's stood up. Not a lot of people go for leadership. Not a lot of people do it when they know they're going to lose, which was the case. And he stood up over, a couple of decades now and said very difficult things to his party and very difficult things to his members. And I think that Russell Findlay needs him, to be honest, to be able to try and bring some sort of coherent programme together.
Yeah. It is a good point, well made, Andy. You'll also note that Andy's 30 seconds was closer to 2 minutes. Just to mention that...
Every time.
I think it's just important to mention the numbers then. So 6,941 is the total number of Tory members. Russell Findlay got 2,565 votes. Murdo Fraser got 1,187. And Megan Gallagher got 403. And the other part of the Tory party conference, just as a final thought on the Tories, has been the national party, the UK party leadership contest. The four candidates are speaking. They're going to make these sort of quick-fire pitches, I think, to members. And then next week, the 9th and 10th, is when they sort of come into the final two. This was quite notable from Tom Tugendhat, who says that Russell Findlay would be given a top post in the shadow cabinet if he was to become the next UK Conservative leader, to try to, I suppose, bridge something of a gap, Andy, that we've talked about existing in the Scottish Conservatives. Could this go some way to bridging that gap? And it's worth noting that I think Tom Tugendhat's probably the candidate who's embraced the Scottish Conservatives most out of the ones who are still in the running.
I think that latter point is definitely true, and there's also no question, by the way, that if you polled the 31 Conservative MSPs, Tom Tugendhat would be the very, very clear winner, and that becomes quite important because it shows you that this is a group of MSPs who are pretty fearful of what might be characterised as a kind of lurch to the more populist reform type right that you might see under Kenny Badenoch or Robert Jenrick. So, I mean, that's an important thing to potentially explore if it happens as well. On the point about the shadow cabinet, this is hardly the first time this sort of concept has been mentioned. There's a long history, I think I would say, of Westminster Conservatives thinking that this sort of thing actually matters to the public. They wouldn't even know about it, let alone it mattering. It's a little bit of lip service to say, look, we absolutely recognise how important Scotland is, and we're such strong unionists, and our precious union, and blah blah blah. It's not a fundamental structural change in the approach, and it isn't a fundamental perception change, which remains that a lot of people in Scotland think that the Conservative Party is fundamentally Devo-sceptic, and the reason they think that is because it is.
Thank you so much for watching. Press subscribe and you'll get all the best videos offering insight on Scottish politics delivered straight to your feed. Press subscribe and stick around. And if you'd like to hear our conversations in full, open up your podcast app and search for Holyrood Sources.